Marcus Chen had been running a $500 million medical device company for exactly 18 months when the seventh caregiver walked through the front door of his Buckhead mansion. 6 others had failed to get his father to speak a single word since the stroke that had stolen his voice on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. This one, Sarah Williams, had 30 days to show measurable progress, or the board would vote to move his father to an institution costing $350,000 a year. The pressure wasn't just financial anymore. 3 board members had already questioned whether Marcus could handle both a Fortune 500 company and a father who hadn't uttered a sound since the day his left hemisphere betrayed him. But Sarah noticed something in her first hour that every neurologist, speech therapist and private care specialist had missed over the past year and a half. When Marcus left the room to take a call about quarterly projections, his father's fingers moved against the arm of his chair in a rhythm that wasn't random at all. The mansion on West Paces Ferry Road had been transformed into something between a luxury home and a medical facility. Parallel bars dominated the living room, where a grand piano used to sit. Communication boards with laminated pictures covered the mahogany walls of what had once been David Chen's study. A $1,000 tablet programmed with voice synthesis software sat untouched on the coffee table, next to stacks of medical journals and insurance paperwork. None of the expensive equipment had produced a single word from the man who had once commanded boardrooms across 3 continents and delivered keynote speeches to audiences of thousands. The silence in the house felt heavier than grief, weighted with the accumulated frustration of 18 months of failed attempts and fading hope. Marcus walked Sarah through the medical history like he was briefing a new board member, clinical and precise, in a way that kept emotion at arm's length. Ischemic stroke 18 months ago, affecting the left middle cerebral artery territory. Extensive damage to Broca's area and surrounding tissue. Complete expressive aphasia with preserved comprehension, though we can't always be sure about the comprehension part since he can't respond verbally. He pulled out a leather folder, thick with medical reports from Emory University Hospital Shepherd Center and 3 private neurologists. Previous caregivers tried picture communication systems, motor oral exercises, computer-assisted speech therapy, even some experimental neurostimulation devices from our own R&D department. Nothing has produced meaningful results. Sarah nodded and set her purse down on the kitchen counter next to a collection of Waffle House napkins and gas station coffee cups. Marcus caught her noticing the evidence of his late-night anxiety rituals. "I drive around when I can't sleep." The Waffle House on Roswell Road is the only place open at 3 in the morning where they don't ask questions about why you're there alone ordering coffee and pie. She smiled without judgment. "Your father used to have trouble sleeping too." The question stopped Marcus mid-motion as he reached for another folder. None of the previous caregivers had asked about his father's personality, his habits, his life before the stroke. They had treated David Chen like a collection of symptoms rather than a person temporarily trapped inside a damaged communication system. "How could you possibly know that?" Marcus asked. Sarah gestured toward the expensive coffee machine that showed signs of multiple daily uses, then toward the kitchen window that faced the back garden where outdoor furniture sat arranged for solitary contemplation. 2 full pots before noon usually means someone else in the house has irregular sleep patterns. And that chair out there is positioned for watching sunrise, not sunset. Early risers and insomniacs often go together, especially in people who spent their careers solving complex problems. Marcus stared at her, recognizing an analytical mind that approached human behavior with the same systematic observation he applied to market research and competitive analysis. They found David in the sunroom, sitting in his wheelchair facing the garden where azaleas were beginning to bloom in the warm Atlanta spring. At 68, he retained the broad shoulders and commanding presence that had built Chen Technologies from a garage startup into a medical device empire, but his eyes held the particular frustration of a brilliant mind trapped behind damaged neural pathways. Sarah introduced herself and sat down in the adjacent chair without launching into the usual barrage of tests, assessments, and forced interactions that had characterized every previous first meeting. Instead, she simply observed, notepad closed, attention focused entirely on David as a person rather than a patient. "Mr. Chen, I'm Sarah Williams. I specialize in communication recovery after neurological injury, and I want to try something different than what you've experienced before." She spoke directly to David, not about him to Marcus. "I suspect there are parts of your mind that are working perfectly, and we've been overlooking them while focusing on what's damaged." Marcus frowned from the doorway. "Every assessment has confirmed that comprehension is largely intact, but speech production is severely compromised. The damaged area controls motor planning for articulation." Sarah turned to him with patient professionalism. "The damaged area controls one pathway for speech production, but the brain has multiple systems for communication, and some of those might be intact and accessible through different approaches." She looked back at David, who was watching their exchange with more attention than Marcus had seen him display in months. "You've been trying to tell us something, haven't you? Maybe not with words, but in other ways." David's right hand, which had been resting motionless on the wheelchair armrest, suddenly moved. Not a random gesture, but a deliberate sequence of movements. Tap, tap, tap against the armrest. Pause, tap, tap. Sarah's pulse quickened with recognition, but she kept her expression neutral, professional, encouraging. "Can you do that again for me?" David repeated the pattern, this time looking directly at her with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what she was asking. That evening, Marcus found himself cancelling his usual return to the corporate offices on Peachtree Street. The building that housed Chen Technologies stayed lit until midnight most nights, as he worked through strategic planning sessions, reviewed R&D reports, and managed the global operations that kept their cardiac monitoring devices in hospitals across 43 countries. But tonight, he sat at his kitchen table, watching Sarah fill pages with observations that looked nothing like the clinical assessments stacking up in his home office. She had spent the afternoon documenting David's behavioral patterns with the meticulous attention to detail that Marcus recognized from his own business analysis processes. Most stroke recovery programs start with what's broken and try to fix it, Sarah explained over Chinese takeout from the restaurant near Chastain Park that David had frequented for 20 years before the stroke. "I want to start with what's still working and build from there." She showed Marcus her notes, which included timing charts of David's alertness patterns, documentation of his responses to different environmental stimuli, and detailed observations about his non-verbal communication attempts. "Your father is trying to communicate constantly. We just haven't been listening in the right language." The breakthrough observation came during her detailed review of David's finger-tapping pattern. Sarah had recorded the timing and sequence over several hours, and when she played it back while humming different melodies, she discovered something remarkable. The tapping pattern matched the opening rhythm of "Bridge Over Troubled Water" by Simon and Garfunkel. It wasn't random movement or nervous fidgeting. It was musical memory expressing itself through the only motor pathway available to him. "Musical memory is stored in different brain regions than conversational speech," Sarah explained to Marcus. "If that system is intact, we might be able to use it as a bridge to rebuild communication pathways. If this moment hits you, tap like. It helps more people find these stories." By the end of the first week, Sarah had established something the previous 6 caregivers had failed to achieve. A therapeutic relationship that David seemed to anticipate and engage with rather than endure. She arrived each morning at 9, spending the first 30 minutes simply sitting with him while he had his coffee and she reviewed the morning news on her tablet. No exercises, no forced interactions, just shared presence that acknowledged his intelligence and dignity while building trust. Then they began what Sarah called competency mapping, systematic exploration of his preserved abilities rather than remediation of his deficits. The musical experiments started small. Sarah played different genres of music during their sessions, while observing David's responses with scientific precision. Classical music left him largely unchanged, though he seemed to appreciate Mozart more than Beethoven. Modern pop music appeared to agitate him, causing visible tension in his shoulders and increased restlessness. Country music prompted mild interest, but no significant response. Jazz elicited some foot-tapping, particularly pieces with prominent bass lines. But when Sarah played The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, everything shifted. David's breathing deepened, his posture straightened, and most significantly, his right hand began moving in that same rhythmic pattern she'd observed on the first day. Marcus watched this transformation from the kitchen doorway, balancing his phone against his shoulder while fielding urgent calls from their head of operations about FDA approval delays for their newest cardiac monitoring system. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday, and 3 members had already expressed concerns about his divided attention affecting company performance. Chen Technologies stock had dropped 4 points since the quarterly earnings report, and institutional investors were asking pointed questions about leadership stability and succession planning. "I need you focused on what matters," his sister Janet had said during their tense phone conversation the night before. "Dad's condition isn't improving. These caregivers are expensive, and frankly, we're enabling your avoidance of the obvious decision." The obvious decision. As if placing his father in a long-term care facility was simply another strategic corporate move to be analyzed, decided, and implemented without emotional interference. Janet lived in Seattle, managing the West Coast operations of Chen Technologies, and her interactions with their father since the stroke had been limited to quarterly visits and weekly video calls where David sat silently while she updated him on business matters he could no longer respond to. Her perspective was shaped by spreadsheets and efficiency metrics rather than the daily reality of watching a brilliant mind struggle to express itself through damaged neural pathways. But watching Sarah work, Marcus began to see something that felt genuinely hopeful for the first time since the stroke. When Bridge Over Troubled Water played, David's entire demeanor changed. His eyes focused with laser intensity on Sarah's face. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, not random movements, but deliberate attempts to shape sounds that matched the melody he was hearing. Sarah caught these micro-expressions immediately and paused the music. "Mr. Jen, I think you're trying to sing along. Can you try that again for me?" David's mouth opened slightly, and a soft sound emerged from deep in his throat. Not a word, but definitely intentional vocalization that lasted 3 full seconds and carried a pitch that roughly matched the song's opening notes. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, then immediately apologized for the outburst. Sarah grinned, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine excitement. "That's exactly the right response. What we just witnessed was intentional musical vocalization from someone diagnosed with complete expressive aphasia. That sound came from preserved neural pathways that we can potentially use to rebuild speech function." She made detailed notes in her pad. Day 7. Sustained intentional vocalization during familiar musical stimulus. Duration 3 seconds. Pitch approximates melody line. Patient maintained eye contact throughout attempt. Marcus stared at his father, who was looking back at him with an expression of surprise, mixed with what appeared to be pride. For 18 months, David had been a passive recipient of care, therapy, and medical intervention. But this moment felt different. This felt like David Chen, the man who had built a Fortune 500 company through determination and innovation, actively participating in his own recovery process. The sound he had made wasn't much by conventional standards, but it represented the first voluntary, purposeful vocalization since the stroke. It was a crack in the wall of silence that had separated David from his family and from himself. The following week brought both significant progress and mounting external pressure. David's responses to specific songs became more pronounced and consistent. During The Sound of Silence, he managed to produce sustained sounds that lasted 10 seconds and clearly attempted to match the melody's phrasing. More importantly, he began to demonstrate anticipation of the music sessions, turning his head toward the speakers before Sarah even approached the sound system, and showing signs of excitement when she announced it was time for musical therapy. His finger tapping became more complex, incorporating rhythms from multiple songs that seemed to be running as a continuous soundtrack in his preserved musical memory. But the corporate pressure was intensifying in direct proportion to David's therapeutic progress. The board meeting had not gone well. 3 members voted to recommend immediate institutional placement, citing mounting costs and Marcus's obvious distraction from fiduciary responsibilities. The company's stock price reflected investor anxiety about leadership continuity, and 2 major clients had specifically asked about succession planning during recent contract negotiations. Only the tie-breaking vote from board chairman William Morrison, who had known David personally for 30 years and remembered him as a man rather than a medical expense, had delayed the institutional placement decision for another 2 weeks. "The numbers don't lie, Marcus," Janet said, spreading financial documents across his kitchen table like evidence in a corporate prosecution. $18,000 a month for specialized home care, plus medical equipment costs, plus the opportunity cost of your reduced focus on operations and strategic planning. We could get him excellent care at Northside's extended care facility for $12,000 monthly, and you could return your attention to running the company Dad built. The spreadsheets were perfectly organized, the calculations ruthlessly accurate, the logic unassailable from a pure business perspective. But the logic couldn't account for the 3-second vocalization David had made during Bridge Over Troubled Water, or the way his eyes tracked Sarah's movements with growing recognition and trust, or the finger-tapping patterns that revealed a mind still vibrantly alive behind the communication barriers. Sarah sensed the mounting pressure without being told specific details about board meetings and family dynamics. She began staying later each evening, documenting every small victory with meticulous precision that would satisfy even the most skeptical medical professional. David's vocalizations were becoming more varied and intentional. During Scarborough Fair, he managed what sounded distinctly like a clear attempt to match the opening vowel sounds of "Are you going to Scarborough Fair?" Even more promising, he had begun humming along with melodies he recognized, his pitch staying remarkably true despite 18 months of enforced silence. The humming represented musical memory not just intact, but actively accessible, suggesting that other complex cognitive functions might be similarly preserved and waiting for the right key to unlock them. "He's accessing musical memory stored in his right hemisphere," Sarah explained to Marcus one evening as they reviewed her increasingly optimistic notes. "That's neurologically separate from the language centers that were damaged by the stroke. If we can use musical pathways to stimulate vocal production, we might be able to rebuild connections to his speech apparatus through alternative neural routes. It's not about fixing what's broken. It's about building new roads around the damage." The theoretical breakthrough was exciting, but Marcus needed practical results that could satisfy board members who measured success in quarterly reports rather than incremental neurological progress. Sarah understood this pressure and had begun structuring her sessions with specific measurable goals that could be documented and presented as evidence of therapeutic effectiveness. She recorded David's vocalizations, timed their duration, measured their pitch accuracy, and tracked their consistency across multiple sessions. The data was beginning to show a clear upward trend that even the most analytically minded board member would have to acknowledge as genuine progress. The major breakthrough came during the third week, on a Thursday morning, when Atlanta's notorious traffic had delayed Sarah's arrival by nearly an hour. Marcus was pacing his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, fielding crisis calls about a potential FDA compliance review of their latest cardiac monitoring device. The review could delay product launch by 6 months and cost the company $12 million in lost revenue, requiring his immediate attention for legal strategy sessions and technical documentation reviews. His father sat alone in the sunroom, and when Sarah finally arrived, breathless and apologetic about the delay, she found David humming softly to himself. Not random sounds or unconscious vocalization, but a clearly recognizable melody, Bridge Over Troubled Water, rendered with remarkable pitch accuracy and emotional expression. He stopped abruptly when he noticed Sarah's arrival, looking almost embarrassed to be caught making music. "Please don't stop," she said gently, setting down her therapy materials and sitting in the chair beside his wheelchair. "That was beautiful. I've never heard you sing like that." She began humming along with the melody, and after a moment of hesitation, David joined her again. This time, during the chorus, something extraordinary happened. He clearly articulated the word bridge, followed immediately by water. 2 words, spoken with perfect clarity and appropriate emotional inflection, emerging from a man who had been completely mute for 18 months. Marcus dropped his phone mid-sentence when he heard Sarah calling his name from the sunroom, with an urgency that cut through his concentration on FDA compliance strategies. He found his father looking directly at him, with more alertness and intention than he'd seen since before the stroke. When Sarah nodded encouragingly, David opened his mouth and said, with startling clarity, "Bridge over water." 4 words that connected his damaged brain to his preserved heart, proving that the essential David Chen remained intact behind the neurological barriers that had silenced him for so long. "Dad," Marcus whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had enabled this miracle of recovered communication. David's eyes filled with tears, but his expression showed determination rather than sadness. He reached out his right hand toward Marcus, and when his son took it, David squeezed firmly and repeated, "Bridge over water." Then, with enormous effort and concentration, he added, "Music helps me find words." Each word came slowly, deliberately, but with unmistakable intentionality and meaning. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's pen, moving rapidly across her notepad, documenting this breakthrough with the precision of a scientist recording a historic discovery. Marcus felt his knees go weak as 18 months of accumulated grief, frustration, and fear transformed into something approaching joy. This wasn't the father he had lost to the stroke, but it was undeniably his father, fighting his way back to connection and communication through whatever neural pathways remained available to him. The voice was different, slower, more deliberate, requiring visible effort, but the intelligence and personality behind it were absolutely recognizable. Over the following days, David's progress accelerated in ways that surprised even Sarah, who had seen successful recoveries before, but never one that moved from complete muteness to conversational speech in such a compressed time frame. During their musical therapy sessions, David could now sing along with several familiar songs, articulating words clearly enough to be understood by unfamiliar listeners. More importantly, he had begun attempting conversational speech outside the structured therapy sessions, asking for specific foods at mealtimes, commenting on news programs, and even making gentle jokes about his own slow-speaking pace. The board meeting scheduled for the end of David's 30-day trial period became a completely different event than anyone had anticipated. Marcus arrived at the Chen Technologies conference room on Peachtree Street with Sarah and a comprehensive presentation documenting David's recovery progress. But the most powerful evidence was David himself. Using a wheelchair-accessible van that Sarah had arranged, David attended the meeting in person, the first time he had been in the corporate offices since his stroke. Board members who had been prepared to discuss institutional placement costs instead found themselves listening to a man they had written off as permanently incapacitated. "I want to thank this board for your patience with my son during my recovery," David said, his words coming slowly but with unmistakable clarity and dignity. "I understand the concerns about leadership and company stability, but Marcus has proven himself capable of managing both responsibilities while I worked to find my voice again." The room was absolutely silent as board members struggled to reconcile this articulate, engaged person with their memories of the silent, unresponsive man they had last seen 18 months earlier. Sarah presented her documentation of David's progress with the precision of a medical researcher defending a groundbreaking study. She had recorded his sessions, measured his vocal improvements, and tracked his expanding vocabulary. The data showed clear, consistent progress that could be projected forward with reasonable confidence. More importantly, she explained the neurological basis for David's recovery in terms that business executives could understand. Undamaged pathways in the brain had been recruited to compensate for damaged areas, like rerouting traffic around a collapsed bridge while building new infrastructure to handle increased capacity. Board member Patricia Hayes, who had voted for institutional care just weeks before, wiped away tears and said, "David, I owe you and Marcus an apology. We were measuring the wrong things and making decisions based on incomplete information." The unanimous vote to continue David's home-based care came with additional resources for Sarah's program and formal recognition that Marcus's leadership during his father's crisis had actually demonstrated exactly the kind of character and competence the company needed during challenging periods. The transformation in David's daily life over the following months was remarkable, not just for its scope, but for its sustainability. His vocabulary expanded weekly, progressing from single words to phrases to complete sentences and eventually to complex conversations about business strategy, family dynamics, and current events. The musical therapy sessions evolved from basic vocalization exercises to discussions of music theory, analysis of different artists' styles, and even collaborative songwriting projects that combined David's business acumen with his newly discovered musical creativity. Sarah documented each phase of this progress, creating a detailed case study that would eventually be published in neurological rehabilitation journals and presented at conferences across the country. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them. The company's response to David's recovery became a model for corporate family care policies throughout Atlanta's business community. Marcus worked with human resources to develop comprehensive support systems for employees dealing with family medical crises, recognizing that personal challenges often brought out leadership qualities and problem-solving skills that directly benefited workplace performance. The policy included flexible scheduling, family care stipends, access to specialized healthcare resources, and most importantly, cultural changes that viewed family caregiving as evidence of character strength rather than professional distraction. David's role within the company evolved as his communication abilities returned. He couldn't resume the demanding schedule and high-pressure decision-making that had characterized his previous leadership position, but he became an invaluable strategic advisor whose perspective was shaped by both decades of business experience and the profound personal insights that came from surviving a life-threatening medical crisis. His counsel was particularly sought during difficult negotiations and complex ethical decisions, where his measured speaking pace and carefully chosen words carried unusual weight and authority. The ripple effects of Sarah's successful intervention extended far beyond the Chen family and their business operations. Her musical therapy approach attracted attention from rehabilitation centers throughout the Southeast, leading to speaking engagements, consultation requests, and eventually the establishment of a training program for therapists who wanted to specialize in music-based communication recovery. The demand for her services grew rapidly as word spread through the medical community about dramatic recoveries that had been achieved through her innovative methods. Sarah's approach was fundamentally different from traditional speech therapy models because it started with preserved abilities rather than damaged functions. Instead of trying to repair broken neural pathways, she identified alternative routes through the brain that could be strengthened and expanded to compensate for damaged areas. This competency-based model required more patience and creativity than conventional approaches, but it produced results that were often more sustainable and comprehensive than traditional rehabilitation methods. The technique that had unlocked David's recovery was subsequently refined and systematized through work with dozens of similar patients. Sarah discovered that musical memory was preserved in many stroke survivors, even those with severe language deficits, because these memories were stored in brain regions that were often spared by the types of strokes that damaged speech centers. By using familiar songs as bridges to vocal production, she could often stimulate communication abilities that neurologists had assumed were permanently lost. David's volunteer work at Shepherd Center began 6 months after his initial breakthrough and quickly became a central part of his weekly routine. 3 mornings each week, he met with newly admitted stroke patients and their families, sharing his story and offering practical hope grounded in realistic expectations about recovery challenges and possibilities. His message was always honest about the hard work required and the limitations that would persist, but it was delivered by someone who embodied proof that significant recovery was possible even after medical professionals had given up hope. The patients and families David counseled found his slow, deliberate speech patterns reassuring rather than concerning, because they demonstrated that meaningful communication could take many forms. His pauses and word-finding difficulties were evidence that he understood their struggles from personal experience, not just professional training. Many patients reported that talking with David gave them permission to accept their altered communication abilities while still working toward improvement, rather than feeling ashamed of speech differences or giving up on recovery goals entirely. Marcus's leadership style had been permanently altered by his experience as his father's primary caregiver and advocate. The skills required for effective caregiving, patience, careful observation, creative problem-solving, collaborative decision-making, and absolute persistence in the face of setbacks proved to be exactly the skills that made someone a more effective corporate leader. His management approach shifted toward identifying and building on employee strengths rather than focusing on performance deficits, creating a corporate culture that consistently ranked among Atlanta's most desirable workplaces. The company's stock price had not only recovered, but was trading 20% higher than pre-stroke levels, driven partly by strong product performance, but also by investor confidence in leadership continuity and corporate culture stability. Marcus had learned to delegate more effectively, trust his executive team more completely, and focus on long-term strategic vision rather than day-to-day operational details. The crisis that had initially threatened his leadership capacity had ultimately made him a more effective and respected CEO. David's recovery plateaued at approximately 75% of his pre-stroke communication abilities, but that 75% included everything essential for meaningful participation in family life, business consultation, and community involvement. The 25% that remained compromised included rapid-fire conversation skills, complex multitasking abilities, and the stamina for extended high-pressure interactions that had characterized his previous corporate leadership role. But the preserved abilities were more than sufficient for a rich, engaged, and contributory life that felt authentic and satisfying to David and his family. Sarah's success with David led to research opportunities at Emory University's medical school, where she collaborated with neurologists and cognitive scientists studying brain plasticity and alternative communication pathways. Her case studies contributed to a growing body of evidence that recovery from neurological injury was possible much later and to a much greater extent than traditional medical models had suggested. The key was identifying preserved capabilities and using them as foundations for rebuilding rather than attempting to directly repair damaged systems. The research implications extended beyond stroke recovery to other neurological conditions, including traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, and various forms of dementia. Musical memory appeared to be remarkably resilient across many different types of brain damage, suggesting that music-based therapies might be effective for a wide range of communication disorders. Sarah's protocols were adapted and tested with different patient populations, yielding promising results that challenged conventional assumptions about permanent neurological limitations. 3 years after his breakthrough, David Chen was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual conference of the American Speech-Language Hearing Association, an honor typically reserved for the most distinguished researchers and clinicians in the field. His speech, delivered slowly but with perfect clarity and emotional resonance, focused on the patient perspective in neurological rehabilitation and the importance of maintaining hope and dignity throughout the recovery process. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with audience members commenting afterward that they had never heard a more powerful presentation about the human reality behind clinical diagnoses and treatment protocols. The business implications of David's recovery story extended far beyond Chen Technologies to influence corporate policies throughout the Atlanta business community and eventually across the country. Human resources professionals began studying the company's family care policies as models for supporting employees through personal crises while maintaining operational effectiveness. The recognition that personal challenges often revealed and developed leadership qualities that benefited workplace performance represented a significant shift in corporate thinking about work-life integration. Marcus had become a sought-after speaker at healthcare conferences, business leadership forums, and medical ethics symposiums, sharing insights about the intersection of corporate responsibility and family caregiving. His message consistently emphasized that the skills required for effective caregiving, patience, observation, creative problem-solving, collaborative decision-making, and absolute persistence were precisely the skills that made someone more effective in any leadership role. The artificial separation between professional competence and personal commitment was not just unnecessary, but actually counterproductive for both domains. The foundation Marcus and Jennifer established after their marriage focused specifically on supporting family caregivers through innovative therapeutic approaches, professional training programs, and direct financial assistance for families who couldn't afford specialized care. David served as the foundation's most visible advocate and primary spokesperson, using his story to raise awareness about the potential for recovery that existed even in seemingly hopeless neurological cases. His presentations always included live demonstrations of the musical techniques that had been central to his own communication recovery, showing audiences how melody could unlock words that conventional therapy couldn't reach. Sarah's practice had evolved into a comprehensive clinic with 6 therapists specializing in music-based communication recovery for various neurological conditions. The clinic served patients throughout the Southeast and provided training for professionals who wanted to incorporate musical techniques into their own therapeutic practices. The success rates were significantly higher than traditional approaches for patients whose musical memory remained intact, though Sarah always emphasized that the goal wasn't to restore everything that had been lost, but to help patients build meaningful communication using whatever pathways remained available to them. The clinic's approach was fundamentally humanistic, treating each patient as a complete person, temporarily experiencing communication challenges rather than as a collection of neurological deficits requiring remediation. This philosophical difference influenced everything from initial assessments to long-term treatment planning, creating therapeutic relationships that patients and families found more respectful and encouraging than conventional medical model approaches. The emphasis on preserved abilities rather than damaged functions helped patients maintain dignity and hope throughout the often lengthy and challenging recovery process. David's podcast, launched 4 years after his stroke, attracted a national audience of stroke survivors, family caregivers, healthcare professionals, and researchers interested in innovative approaches to neurological rehabilitation. Each monthly episode featured interviews with patients, families, and professionals about different aspects of recovery, adaptation, and the practical realities of living with communication differences. David's voice on the recordings retained the measured pace and thoughtful pauses that characterized his post-stroke speech, but listeners consistently commented that these differences made him more relatable and trustworthy than perfectly polished media personalities. The podcast's most popular episodes featured conversations between David and other stroke survivors about the emotional and practical challenges of recovery, the importance of maintaining hope without setting unrealistic expectations, and the ways that neurological injuries could actually lead to positive life changes and deeper relationships. These peer-to-peer discussions provided insights and encouragement that professional counseling often couldn't match, creating a community of support that extended far beyond formal healthcare settings. Marcus's twins, born 5 years after David's stroke, knew their grandfather only in his recovered state, and considered his careful speech patterns and musical way of communicating to be simply how Grandpa David talked. They learned naturally to be patient during his word-finding pauses, to appreciate the melody in his voice, and to understand that meaningful communication could take many different forms. Their easy acceptance of his communication differences often put visiting adults at ease, who initially felt uncertain about interacting with someone whose speech was obviously different from typical patterns. The children's relationship with David provided ongoing evidence that his recovery had been not just medically successful, but socially and emotionally complete. He could read them stories, sing lullabies, answer their endless questions about everything from dinosaurs to space travel, and provide the kind of patient, attentive grandfather presence that young children treasure. His communication limitations were simply part of who he was, requiring no special accommodations or awkward adjustments from family members who had learned to value substance over speed in conversation. The medical community's response to David's case and Sarah's therapeutic approach evolved from initial skepticism to growing acceptance and eventual enthusiasm for research collaboration. Neurologists who had initially dismissed musical therapy as unscientific began referring patients for evaluation after witnessing results that their conventional treatments couldn't achieve. The integration of music-based approaches into standard stroke rehabilitation protocols represented a significant shift toward more holistic, patient-centered care models that addressed the whole person rather than just neurological deficits. Sarah's research contributions to peer-reviewed journals documented not just individual success stories, but systematic evidence that musical pathways in the brain could be reliably accessed and strengthened to compensate for damaged speech centers. Her work contributed to a broader understanding of brain plasticity and the potential for recovery that existed much later after injury than traditional medical models had suggested. The implications extended beyond stroke recovery to other neurological conditions, opening new research directions and treatment possibilities for patients who had been told that significant improvement was impossible. The Chen family's annual Christmas gathering, now in its 6th year since David's stroke, had become a celebration not just of holiday traditions, but of the remarkable journey from silence to recovered communication that had transformed their entire understanding of resilience, adaptation, and the nature of meaningful human connection. David moved easily between conversations with 4 generations of family members, his speech slower than it had been before the stroke, but rich with personality, wisdom, and the deep contentment of someone who had faced the possibility of permanent silence and fought his way back to full participation in the life he had built over 7 decades. The business had continued to thrive under Marcus's leadership, expanding into new international markets while maintaining its reputation for innovation in medical device technology and corporate culture that supported employees through personal challenges. The family care policies that had originated from Marcus's need to balance corporate leadership with his father's care requirements had become a defining characteristic of the company culture, attracting top talent and creating employee loyalty that translated directly into improved performance and reduced turnover costs. 10 years after the stroke, David Chen celebrated his 78th birthday, surrounded by 3 generations of family at the same Buckhead mansion where his recovery had begun. His great-grandchildren, energetic toddlers who called him Singing Grandpa, climbed onto his lap while he hummed softly to them in the same sunroom where Sarah had first heard him attempt to match the melody of Bridge Over Troubled Water. His voice carried the full weight of personality, love, and hard-won wisdom, delivering lullabies and stories with the same careful precision that had characterized all his communication since the breakthrough that had restored his voice. Sarah, now director of the Southeast Center for Musical Communication Therapy and a nationally recognized expert in neurological rehabilitation, still worked with David twice weekly. Though their sessions had evolved into something more like conversations with therapeutic structure than formal treatment. They discussed current events, family dynamics, business challenges, and David's growing involvement in advocacy work for stroke survivors and research funding. Their relationship had become a friendship grounded in shared experience of the recovery process and mutual respect for the determination required to rebuild communication abilities that most people took for granted. The ripple effects of David's recovery continued to expand through multiple spheres of influence. The Chen Technologies family care policies had been studied and adapted by corporations throughout the Southeast and beyond, creating a new standard for supporting employees through family medical crises. Sarah's therapeutic techniques had been taught to hundreds of professionals working in neurological rehabilitation across the country. The foundation Marcus and Jennifer had established now funded research projects at 12 universities, supported training programs in 8 states, and provided direct assistance to thousands of families dealing with communication disorders following neurological injuries. David's volunteer work had evolved into a formal consulting role with Shepherd Center, where he helped design patient advocacy programs and family support services based on his personal experience of recovery and his business background in strategic planning and organizational development. His insight into both the medical and emotional aspects of neurological rehabilitation proved invaluable for improving patient care protocols and family education programs. Healthcare professionals consistently reported that his perspective helped them understand the patient experience in ways that influenced their clinical practice and therapeutic relationships. The podcast David hosted had become required listening for many speech therapy training programs, providing future professionals with authentic patient perspectives on recovery challenges, therapeutic relationships, and the practical realities of living with communication differences. David's interviews with other survivors, family members, and healthcare professionals created a comprehensive resource that complemented academic training with real-world insights about the human dimensions of neurological rehabilitation. Episodes focusing on the family impact of communication disorders were particularly valuable for helping professionals understand the broader context of their clinical interventions. Marcus's marriage to Jennifer, a pediatric nurse who had been drawn to his family's story through her own interest in medical advocacy, had produced not just personal happiness, but professional collaboration that strengthened both their careers. Jennifer's clinical background complemented Marcus's business experience, creating a partnership that enhanced their foundation's effectiveness in identifying promising research projects and supporting innovative therapeutic approaches. Their shared commitment to improving healthcare outcomes for families facing neurological challenges had become a defining characteristic of their relationship and their joint philanthropic work.